An individual's demand for a particular commodity can be defined as the quantity of the good in question that the individual is willing and able to purchase during a given time period. Note the phrases, both willing, implying that the individual wants the commodity in question, and able to purchase, implying that the individual has the means to satisfy this want. Market demand is then given by the summation of all the individual consumers' demand curves. Whether we are looking at an individual or a particular market, this demand will depend on a number of factors. And we can see these here. Here we have what is known as a fairly general demand function. QD represents the quantity demanded of our particular good, good A. PA is the price of this particular good. PB through to Z represent the prices of other goods. Now I have B all the way through to Z there to imply that in some cases there can be a large number of other prices that affect our individual good. Usually this depends upon the exact definition of the good in question. Other variables that we have there, disposable income. This is income after tax has been deducted. And lastly, tastes. The idea being here along the lines of fashion, so that sometimes individuals increase their demand for a particular good as a result in changes in particular fashions, and indeed reduce them again. Now, given the complexity of this demand function, we can only derive a demand curve which relates quantity demanded to its own price by assuming that all the other variables, all the other factors in there, remain constant. However, this is not a particularly restrictive assumption, because if we could identify the separate effects of each of the variables in there, we can effectively create our demand curve between quantity and own price. And one technique which would allow us to do this is regression analysis, which I believe you've all come across. Actually looking at the relationship between quantity demanded and its own price, and plotting that relationship, we have our demand schedule, our demand curve. And note, this demand curve slopes downwards from left to right, implying that the lower the price, the larger the quantity demanded. Effectively, we have a negative relationship here. Now, movement along this demand curve is normally termed an expansion when we move to the right, or a contraction when we move to the left. Now, even though, because we're looking in two dimensions here, we only have price, own price, and quantity demanded, we can still, using this framework, look at the effect of other factors in our demand function on quantity demanded. Let's do each of those in turn. Firstly, the price of other goods. Now here, the exact effect will depend upon whether our goods are substitutes or complements. If we look at the first case, where we have, let's say, substitutes. Here what we mean is that there's a rise in the price of good B, let's say, one of our other goods, and this leads to an increase in the demand for good A, then A and B are said to be substitutes. Consumers effectively switch from the more expensive good to the relatively cheaper alternative. Example here might be butter and margarine. Now we can actually show that using our demand curves as a shift in the demand curve. Now if we had an increase in the price of our other good, let's say margarine, and this led to an increase in the demand for butter, then we'd effectively have a shift in our demand curve to the right. For every given own price, more of the good is demanded. Given the same situation where we had a fall in the price of our substitute good, we'd have a decrease in demand, a shift in our demand curve to the left. So that's the case where we have substitutes. Second type of relationship we could have between goods is where we have complements. Here, if there is a fall in the price of one good, and this leads to an increase in the demand for another good, then we say that the two goods in question are complements. The goods tend to be purchased together. For example, certainly in the case of the UK economy, eggs and bacon, for example, which tend to go together. Now here, if we have a rise in the price of the complement good, we'd expect a decrease in the demand for our particular good, which is again reflected by a shift in the demand curve to the left. Whereas if we had a fall in the price of our complement good, then we'd expect an increase in the demand for our particular good, reflected by a shift in the demand curve to the right. Other factors which we had in our demand function. Disposable income, let's say. Here, the relationship that exists depends on the nature of the good in question. If we have a normal good, demand increases as income increases. We have a positive relationship. So here, if we have an increase in disposable income, we'd have a shift in our demand curve to the right. If we had a fall in disposable income, then we'd have a shift of our demand curve to the left. There's one other feature to highlight here, and that's the possibility of no relationship between income and the quantity demanded of our particular good. In this situation, our demand curve would stay exactly where it is, indicating no relationship between income and quantity demanded. Finally, tastes. These are the most difficult to model, but can be very important for some particular goods. Again, we have a situation if tastes change in favour of a product, of a shift in the demand curve to the right. Tastes change away from the product, a shift in the demand curve to the left.